Welcome, everyone, to Paranormal Roundtable. I'm your host, Josh Turner, and this is what we call PRT. So, pretty ruckus time, right? Is that what we can...
Yeah, we cause a ruckus sometimes.
Yeah. So, we got Anthony and we got Mushu in the house, and I guess Banjo's in with us, too. So we're keeping our word. We're going to be dropping these shows. I guess we decided on Wednesday because the election. So we're going to do a Wednesday. And this one's going to be interesting. I enjoyed listening to this story. This story was really interesting to me. But before we get started on that and this go on this adventure, don't forget we have a Patreon. It's a great way to support the show. We have a $10, $20, $30, $40, $50 tier. Each tier going up gives you a bigger swag bag, better prizes for whatever. And then we're going to start doing on the November 21st will be our first Patreon Q&A. So if you join the Patreon, that's a good thing to join the Patreon. We'll put the link in there, right? Show everybody.
Yeah.
And then join the Patreon, and you can be entered into what you can win. You can win a contest. That's the membership. My bad. The membership. If you join a if you buy a membership, you can enter to win. Every Sunday we do a giveaway.
Mm-hmm.
So we have for the last 2 weeks. We've been back on the saddle giving away stuff or whatever because we're a little more stable. We're slowly getting more stable with our living situation and everything else. But I want to tell everybody, people keep asking this question. I don't know why they don't know, but you should know this, especially if you listen to the live streams or, if you listen to us on Spotify or whatever, you should know this. PRTpodcast.com, Josh Turner. At PRTpodcast.com. That's how you get a hold of us. People are like, where do I send the stories to? Or you can send me through Messenger on Facebook. I'm Josh Turner 940 on Instagram. I'm not hard to find. I'm not hiding. So just different ways to get in touch with me. Okay. What else do we got going on? Anything else we need to talk about?
No, I think you covered it.
That's pretty much it. Well, here's what I got to tell you. If you're on the Patreon, we're not putting anything behind a paywall. Okay, we're just doing a Q&A to where you can get to know us a little bit better, and you can have time to talk to us. Because you're paying money every month. And so you're supporting the show. You're a supporter. You're helping keep the show going, and we appreciate that. And so that's one way of us being able to show our appreciation. We're not telling stories that you won't be able to hear on the show. So that's not the case, but you can ask questions about that week's episodes and we can go more in depth to it. So anyway, this story here comes from Latvia. And I don't know if you know where Latvia is. A lot of people probably, they're like, what is that? Where is that at? It is in Eastern Europe. It is below Estonia. Estonia is to the north. And to the east is Russia. To its west is the Baltic Sea. To the south west is Lithuania. To the southeast is Belarus. Now, here's what happened. We did a show called the Vampire. Was it the Vampire of Belarus?
I think it was like the Flying Vampire of Belarus, something like that.
I don't remember which. It was the Belarusian vampire, basically. And so we had a listener, and this is pretty cool. His name was Marta, and she got in touch with me. Her and her cousin her cousin lives in Riga. That's the capital of
Latvia.
Latvia, yeah. And now she's living there with her cousin, and her cousin got her started on the show. Well, the interesting thing is Marta reached out to me, and she says, me and my cousin, we love your show. We're living in Riga. She's like, but that's not where we're from. We didn't grow up there. They actually grew up in a little bitty town that's right there on the border. It's called Sida, but it's south of Valka. And at one point, her dad, Marta's dad, is from Valka, and that is on the border with Estonia. It's right on the border of Estonia and Latvia. And here's what's interesting: when during World War II, it started in World War II. Okay, we'll go back to that. In 1943, the Germans, the war was in full swing between Germany and Russia, and they were losing ground, gaining ground. It was going back and forth, back and forth. I know if some of you have heard the stories of the werewolves of World War II we did. That's another very, very popular episode. And so anyways, Marta and her cousin, they heard me talking about the stories that we had gotten from Belarus, and they thought, you know what, we live in Latvia and we have a story. And this is very interesting. We also got a Polish vampire story, or a Polish werewolf story, I believe is a werewolf. This creature here, I don't know what it is. You can make up your own mind and decide what you think this is. I'm leaving it open to interpretation. I know what I kind of think it is, but I can't tell you, the listener, until we're done laying all the evidence of what we got, from these people. So what happened was, brother and sister Anna and Vladimir. These are the I guess that would be the uncle and the grandmother, the great uncle and the grandmother of Marta. And so Marta says, my grandmother Anna told me a story when I was a kid, and it terrified me. And she goes, and my little brother was absolutely terrified. He wouldn't even go outside at night. And so she goes, for years, we all thought, me and my cousins and my siblings thought it was just a story that Anna had made up, Grandma Anna had made up, to keep us kids in line, to not go outside so that this thing wouldn't hurt us, attack us, whatever. Well, she goes, it worked. She said it worked a little too well because she wouldn't even go camping. And, there was just, but she found out later on that, Vladimir, her great uncle, and his sister, her grandmother, weren't lying about this. She found out that there were more people who had actually heard of this. Now, during the war, her grandmother's first cousin fell in love with a German officer, and when they were in full-on retreat, her family had been killed by the Soviets. So this German officer actually, they don't know exactly how it worked, but he smuggled her back into Germany. And they ended up getting into West Germany, and where he surrendered to the Allies. And he was not in the SS, he was in the Wehrmacht. And apparently, years later, she went to go visit these relatives that were living in, I guess is in West Germany. And so she goes, when we go to visit these relatives in West Berlin, she's like, we realized when we started talking, the kids were her age, her mother, this would have been her mother's like first cousin or whatever. And so she said that this cousin told her, or I guess that would have been her grandmother's first cousin. So the mother and this woman were their parents were first cousins. And so these were the people that they were friends with, and this happened after the wall fell. So they were able to go to Germany and visit. And she said it was amazing to go to West Germany and go to West Berlin, which was actually just Berlin now at that time. But this was the first Western country that she had visited. And she said it was just a very, normal night. They were talking, they were playing cards, and they were drinking a few drinks. And she said that it came up in conversation about this creature that they did not have a name for. It was just in their Latvian language, it was just called the Nameless thing. They didn't know what it was, but it was something that had been preying upon the people of this really small village right outside of Valka. And it had been going on for generations. And it had been taking livestock and then the occasional person, the straggler that would be walking home. Some people claimed it was a vampire. Some people claimed that it looked like a monster, like a hairy monster. And some people just said that it was a demon. They didn't know what it was. And they still to this day don't really have a name for it. But she said that there was a lot of people who knew about this creature, but they wouldn't talk about it because they felt like, and we know this, Tony, coming from Vietnamese, and of course, I and Anthony, my mother being Hispanic descent, don't talk about it because if you talk about it, you talk it up and it'll show up. And so there's this terrifying, track record. They're like, if you talk about this creature, it's going to show up and it'll take you away. And supposedly it did that, right, to some people. So there was a guy, I don't know his name, but he was walking home from a bar one night in Volca to this little village where they were living, and this was in 1938 when this happened, supposedly. And this man was friends with her grandfather. And her grandfather, Alexander, had told her, he said that this man was walking home because she didn't believe it. So Grandma Anna told this story. So Alexander sat down one day. He took a shot of vodka, and he looked at Marta as a child. He patted her on the head, and he said, "Let me tell you the story of my friend who was walking home one night." And he said, "I challenge this thing to do something to me, if it's real." And he looked up toward the heavens when he said it. He walked outside of the tavern that they were in, and then he proceeded to walk home alone, which was only about a 4-kilometer walk, and he was never seen again. So shortly after this, the Russians had already, the Soviets, they would be the Soviets at that time, had already laid down on Latvia and had control of it, but they were not as they were spread thin. They had soldiers all over the Eastern Bloc, and so they did not have it wasn't as bad as it was after the war. After the war, Stalin became very paranoid, and he put huge garrisons all over this Eastern Bloc, in particular Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine were very suppressed. They had a lot of attention from Russia. And then, of course, Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all of them they went under the boot heel of the Soviet Union. It's a very horrible, miserable thing that happened. But back then they still had some freedom. And then in 1939, war broke out, and of course Russia invaded Poland, and all hell broke loose. And then the Germans invaded Russia a couple years later. They broke the treaty and they attacked. And so we're not going to get into a big history lesson. We don't have time, or I would. But what happened was when they went back and they met these half-German cousins, they started talking about this. And the first cousin of her grandmother, who was still alive, and her daughter, I don't know her name, but they were all there. They were talking about this creature. And she says, "Look, your grandmother was not wrong about this." So, her grandmother had been saying that there was this creature. Now, supposedly it attacked her and her little brother, Vladimir, when she was 14 and he was 11. And they escaped from it. Now, according to the official story that was put out by whatever, I guess the newspapers at that time, was that there was a flap and people were seeing a giant bird. But that's not what happened. According to the people who this happened to, this was not a giant bird. And what this thing looked like was anything but a bird. It had this black skin. It only appeared at night, and it was black like the darkness black. Like you see the darkness, you could only see it. It was like darker than the night sky, especially on a moonlit night. And it had a very demonic face. It had a short muzzle with huge teeth, and it had pointy ears, and it had a big pointy nose, and the nose hung down kind of over the lips, and this thing had glowing red eyes, and you could see it coming from the sky, and it would make this screeching, howling noise, and you could hear the wings flapping, and the wings were very specific. They were bat-like wings. This thing had long, skinny arms, and skinny legs, and a skinny torso with big talons on the feet and the hands. The legs were backward bent like a dog like legs, and it protruded like this. When it would open its mouth to bite people, it was like the mouth would kind of come out. The lips would curl back, and it seemed like the teeth would kind of jut out of the mouth. They watched this thing devour sheep. They watched it kill dogs. They watched it kill cattle, even pick up full-grown cows and take off and abscond with them. And it was just, the predation was horrible to where that whole area was like in a panic. And by the time the Germans had invaded and driven the Soviets back, they were treated kind of as liberators, right? And the people of Seda, which is, like I said, it's like southwest of Valka, that whole area right there, they were in a tizzy. They were terrified. And so they asked the German soldiers if they could do something about it. At first, the Germans were taken aback and were like, what is this? What are you talking about? And they said that they were describing this creature to the Germans. And surprisingly, most of the Germans didn't know what the hell they were talking about, but some of them did. Like a couple of the higher-ups were like, okay, yeah. And one of the German officers, who was actually a lower-ranking German officer, who ended up marrying her grandmother Anna's first cousin, who they said was very beautiful, he managed to smuggle her back and got across to West Berlin, to surrender to Patton. So what ended up happening, he got put in a POW camp. He eventually got out and got with his love that he had met in Latvia, and they got married and had children. He was already deceased by the time that they had gone to visit their family in West Berlin. But she's like, I'll never forget that night. She goes, I was 19 at the time when they went to go visit this family, whatever. And she said, we were in West Berlin, and we had gone dancing to a club or whatever. And it hadn't been that long since the wall had fallen. It was a couple of years. And she said that it was awesome time to be alive, And the German people were still trying to get accustomed to being around each other. The West and East Germans were totally different people at that time. And she said that they had cousins that were from East Germany and that they were coming and visiting. And one of those cousins, a guy named Hans, had actually said that he had served with the man who ended up marrying Anna's cousin. And he said, I was there. And he goes, and I remember this creature, the nameless thing. And he's like, it looked like what we would call in Germany a vampire. That's what it looked like. It was a flying creature, and it exsanguinated animals. But it would also eat their flesh, but it would predominantly drink blood. And it attacked several of their soldiers. And one of the most gruesome things that happened was this particular German, he said, when we had entered into a barn right there in Seda, right outside of Seda, there was this guy had a big farm right there, and the Russians had laid down like an ambush for the Germans. But when they got there, apparently they had all been killed. By what, they don't know. And they honestly didn't believe that it was just one creature, because it looked like they had shot each other up, which is really interesting. I was reading about a place in Finland where it's like the mountain of death. And it's something I want to talk about eventually. I'm going to talk about it on the show. I'll do this story too. And something very similar had happened to the Russians. 100 Russians had been killed. There was a war called the Winter War. And Anthony, I'm sure you know what that is. The Finnish had fought the Russians prior to World War II. And then, of course, they helped invade the Soviet Union because they were Germany's ally. But before that happened, there was this war. And, of course, the Finnish never went up onto that hill. They just didn't do it. And the Laplanders from Finland, they're like the natives, right? They're from that region. They were like kind of like Eskimo people. They were like, don't do it. They told the Russians not to do it. And the Russians were stubborn. And instead of listening to these people, they're called the Sami people. They actually just murdered them. And stupidly, the Finnish knew better. The Finnish were like, no, the Laplanders, the Sami, they don't go up there to that mountain. And so it's a long story, but it's a very good story. And I'm going to get into that one day. And I have somebody who gave me information about that story. But they called it the Mountain of Death. And these Russians, same thing. The Russians were communists, so they didn't believe in anything. They didn't believe in any of these stories. Whereas the Germans, They did. They had a lot more, I guess they were a lot more superstitious. The Russian soldier was conditioned to not believe in God, not to believe in anything, and to be very superstitious, not to be superstitious at all. So even if they were raised with these, what they considered peasant ideas of ghosts and goblins and Baba Yaga, you were not allowed to have those beliefs. You served at the will of the Communist Party, and that was it. And so it seemed like the Russians had shot each other in their own ambush. So when Hans and his unit went in, they found Russian soldiers scattered all over the place that were dead. Them and Latvian troops that had been conscripted to join they were forced to join the Russian military, and so they followed it all up into a barn where they found half-eaten, half-chewed-on Latvian and Russian soldiers, and a couple that were literally like bloodless, that were hanging upside down and that had been drained of blood. So whatever had done this had caused some serious carnage. There was like 15, 16 bodies that had been killed, but it looked like they didn't all die in the same way or at the same time. They couldn't figure it out. It was like a mystery. And so they cleared the bodies out, and they used this area that the Russians had set up as like a makeshift base or whatever, So the Germans took it over. Well, the first night that they were there, according to what this man told Anna's family, Marta's family, he said, we heard this screeching, like howling noise coming from the sky. And then we saw the top of the barn just literally collapse and fall in. And several of the soldiers that were there, this was an SS unit, and they began to open fire on this, what they described as an 8-foot-tall, massive black creature with humongous wings. The wingspan, they claimed, was 6 foot across on each wing, which was about 12 feet. So this thing was massive. The wings were freaking massive, and it came down and swooped in and just unalived 2 soldiers like immediately, just slicing through them and nearly decapitating them, and then began to like devour them quickly, drinking their blood. As they opened fire, they ended up like wounding one another. And then they realized after this thing left and absconded with one of the bodies, they realized this is probably what happened to these Latvian and Russian soldiers. So they went to the local Latvians, and they asked them there in Sida, and they asked them, they said, what is going on here? What is this thing? Do you know anything about it? Why are we being attacked by this creature? And they said, this thing has been attacking people in Valka and in Sida, and then there's these other little towns, around that area, little villages and stuff. And it's been doing it for decades. It had been going on since the 1800s, as far back as anybody could remember. And that some of the people that were still alive from the 1800s, the elderly, the elders, they were talking about this creature, and they claimed that it was brought across from the Baltic, from some other place, and that it was like it just appeared one day on an abandoned ship from the Baltic, and they don't know how or where it came from. But after that ship arrived, it just moved its way from town to town to town, and there were reports of it going across, all the way across Latvia, parts of Estonia, and it ended up in Valka. And so that's the best story that they could come up with. Now, this could just be something that they used to make up this whole whatever, just so they could explain how this creature was doing whatever it did. But the truth is, they probably really didn't know. But the Germans were smart, and they set a trap for this thing. And they used a dead cow that had been killed by the Russians, and they set it up outside of this barn. And sure enough, that night, it came back down to try to feast on this cow. And they managed to shoot it several times in the back, and it did actually work. They used a high-powered 20 mil to blast a giant hole through this creature, and it looked like they had killed it. Once this 20 mil hit and it knocked this creature down, it appeared that they had knocked a giant hole in its chest, and it was dead. So they put nets on it, they wrapped it up, they put the arms behind its back, and they hung it up in the barn. And when the higher ups came in, one of the generals had came through there. Now, general is not the highest rank in their military; it's a field marshal. But one of the generals came through there supposedly with his people, and one of his understudies came in and told him. I guess he had like the rank of colonel, and he told him. He says, "What is this?" And they said, "This is a creature that killed 2 of our men." And it also unalived all these Russian and Latvian people. They have this whole story about it in this village. They say that it's been doing this for years, and it just goes from town to town, and there's records of it and blah, blah, blah. A few of these Germans actually had made their way across this country by the time they had gotten this far east, and they had heard of this thing. They had heard of a flying creature in northern Latvia that had been predating on animals and killing people occasionally, and that it was sort of a vampiric type entity. They don't know what it is or what it was, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So the Germans were convinced that it was something that the Soviets had created, right? So they were going to take it and send it back to Germany and send it back to the West to their scientists so they could get a bead and figure out what it was. So they brought a transport in, and they loaded this thing up to the back of the truck. Well, they didn't even make it out of the town. They got like halfway out of the town, and next thing you know, this thing is alive and well, and it's attacking the soldiers in the back of this truck that are supposed to be guarding it. And one of them fell out the back of the truck and broke his neck, and 2 of them were disemboweled. And then this thing broke its way out of the back and was flying through the air again. The hole in its body supposedly was healing up, right? Now, Martha said she was completely enthralled by this story of this creature. And she did some research, and she found out that the first sighting of this creature in that area where she was from was in this little bitty town called Ladana, which is like, I don't know if that's a little bitty village or whatever. It's not on the map, but I guess it was in between Seda and Volka, some little bitty village or whatever, was pretty much wiped out by the Soviets when they came back to drive the Germans out. They were accused of helping the Germans, which a lot of Latvians did, and they were burned alive. So they killed like 370 people. They just murdered them, which is what the Soviets were really good at. And so, these people, they suffered bad because they had to deal with the Soviets being on top of them. Then the Germans came, and then the Soviets drove them back out. And so it was horrible. It was just like what happened with the Belarusians. You fight for us or die, then the next army comes in, fight for us, or you die, basically. So they just went back and forth, and it was just death all around. And this creature was enjoying this carnage. But the first sighting was in 1886 was the first time that, but according to some of the officials that had in Volka, they had actually said that this thing was not the first time that it was seen in Latvia, that it was actually seen in a city called Alaja or Alaja. I don't know. She wrote it down as Alaja. And that's where it was first documented that this creature had made an appearance. It was just an unidentified flying creature that had taken off with someone's sheep, a local shepherd. The next night, he disappeared. So we don't know a whole lot about where this creature really was from or what it was. We just know that it appeared, and the next thing you know, all hell breaks loose, and then it goes from town to town, and it just raised hell. And then in parts of southern Estonia, there's stories of this thing where that it had murdered people and livestock, animals, whatever. But according to what Anna, her grandmother, had said, her and her brother Vladimir after the war, the Russians had taken back control and they captured this creature. And they had it in a metal crate with bars and everything. And she says her and her brother snuck to the rail station to go and look to see it. And they saw it. And she said that it was a pitiful looking thing and that it was hunched over with its head down between its knees. And she said that her brother, overcome with the feeling of sadness for this creature, and then he started to think the stories about it weren't even true. It was just Soviet and German propaganda. So he decided to try to reach into the cage and give it some bread.
What a great idea.
Yeah. Of course, he's a kid, you know? And so she said before Sonia, their cousin, could even that's her name, Sonia. Before Sonia, the cousin, could even react, this thing had grabbed him by the arm and had bitten him, and he fell backwards and big chunk of his arm was taken out. And he ended up going to the hospital and nearly dying. And so they ended up having to take him to Riga, which is the capital, and give him multiple blood transfusions because he wouldn't stop bleeding. Now get this. Whatever this thing had in its saliva, it was an anticoagulant because the blood, it would not coagulate. His blood continued to flow and he nearly bled to death.
Don't vampire bats have something
Exactly.
similar?
Yeah, that's one thing I thought about. So she said that they said that, are you sure this was some kind of creature? They described it, but the Soviets had already shipped it off back to the East. And then somewhere when in Russia, when they got back to Russia, the stories are, now this, I don't know how they know this, but the story goes that it ended up getting loose and it was flying around somewhere over Western Russia and it was wreaking havoc. And she said that there are stories from the Russians who actually ended up living in Latvia and claimed, yeah, that thing escaped off the train and killed multiple soldiers and ended up, you know, living somewhere in Western Russia. Nobody knows where it came from or what it is, but it does sound very similar to some of the accounts that we get of these flying creatures near Baalbek, you know, in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And so one of my friends is Lebanese. I asked him about that and I described this to him, and you know who I'm talking about. He actually told me, he says, dude, that sounds almost identical to one of these creatures from the pits of Baalbek, which is, you know, that's where they used to worship Baal, Haman Baal in particular. And of course, there is a giant pit there that's been covered over with giant stone to keep whatever is in there from coming out. But every now and then, they have to redo this and fix it. And they say that whenever they do, there's always at least one or two workers that ends up dying because something always manages to get out of it. And then they go and it flies around and does whatever it does and kills people. And supposedly many, many people died before they covered that hole. And it's very well known in Lebanon that if you go to that place, you can hear these demonic creatures screeching and howling underneath the giant stone that covers the well or hole of Baalbek. And so I don't know that this is what this was. I don't know if it was something, some people say it was something that the Germans had brought, that they had captured in the Middle East because they had a lot of allies in the Middle East. And so they may have been given something, or it could have been the Soviets. The Soviets were, you know, they had captured, you know, a lot of territory, you know, and they had invaded a part of Iran. So they thought maybe this thing was taken back from the Persians. They don't know. They don't really know exactly where it came from. There is another case that I found of a creature very similar in Georgia, you know, in southern Russia. It's another country that became part of Russia. But this story in particular, Martha claims that she did some sleuthing and she found out that Vladimir was very sickly the rest of his life and that he needed kidney dialysis when he got older, which he couldn't get. And he eventually died, and he never was the same. And he couldn't go out in the sun. He developed an affliction that made him not be able to go out in the sun without being burned. and that his eyes couldn't see in the daylight, and it was whatever this thing was, it gave him something, you know. And his blood, he was always needing blood transfusions, you know, and that he would start bleeding. He became hemophiliac. Prior to that, he wasn't. So I don't know. When you stop and you look at this case of this flying creature, we here at PRT, we've done a lot of work with international cases and things like that, and talking to people from all over the world. And thank goodness that we did the story about Belarus, because we never would have got this story. But you know, when he heard us talking about this particular case, another cool thing too is just a sideline. One of her cousins plays Age of Empire, and I think I played against him when she started telling me about it. I said, I think I know him. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, a lot of these Eastern Europe, they like that game, and they also play that one game. What's it? It's been around forever. The one where they go in and they have like whole rooms where they play it. It's very popular. Still, it's an old game.
I mean, what kind of game is it?
It's like a first-person shooter game, I think.
Counter-Strike?
Counter-Strike, there you go.
Yeah.
So anyway, she says, my cousin plays Counter-Strike, and I was like, yeah, he probably played against my nephews. So Counter-Strike has been around forever, but that's one of the games they play too. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just me, the gamer in me, that I don't get to play games much anymore, but I used to love video games. But yeah, we started talking, and very interesting. Marta's very interesting. One of her cousins, he's Nikolai, he's a very intelligent guy, a microbiologist, and he is very intrigued by whatever this disease was that was given to their great uncle, Vladimir, and what it could have been. And then he was sterile. He never could have children after this happened. And they think that before that, he was a healthy young boy, and then he ended up with this affliction or illness, whatever. Well, years later, before he died, Soviet troops came to their house and drug him out of the apartment that they lived in. And he was taken from Latvia to Moscow. And he lived there for 2 years, and then he was returned. When he was returned, he was an emaciated shell of his former self, and that they had done all kinds of experiments on him. And the Latvian authorities, of course, they had turned him over to the Soviets because they had no control. The Soviets controlled everything. Really, it was Russia. And they think that he was being looked at because they knew that this creature was responsible for turning him into whatever he was. And like maybe some sort of hybrid, you know, it's a blood disorder for sure. But they claimed that he had some sort of parasite that was unkillable. That's what he was diagnosed with. And so the Latvian and Russian authorities said, well, this guy's got some kind of parasite. We can't get rid of it. We don't know what it is. His blood was a very dark color, almost black. Whenever they would take his blood, it was like a deep, dark color, and it looked almost like black goo.
And it's a parasite, which is what we talked about on Vampire Confessions and Werewolf Confessions.
Yeah. And so this creature, it sounds an awful lot like a rogue elder of these vampire creatures. You know?
That's what I was thinking, that it's like one of those primordial, like very ancient vampire creatures from which the modern day ones, you know,
all
descend.
kind of hail from. Yeah. And so here's an interesting thing. In that same community, in that little bitty village or whatever, Ladona, whatever it was, that little village that was wiped out, there was supposedly a witch. I guess he would be considered a warlock. And the villagers were terrified of this guy. And he was considered to be able to shapeshift, and that he had a wolf's pelt that he could use to change into a wolf. And a lot of people were really scared to death of this guy. And so whenever this creature started doing whatever it was doing, people were going to this guy and paying him with, you know, I'm talking like giving him hens and eggs and sheep and whatever they could pay him with. One family even gave him a mule, whatever, just to give the protection from this creature. And supposedly he was the only person in that village that was safe from this creature, because he would roam around at night and nothing would ever happen to him. And if he was around, that it was said that if he was around or if you were with him, particularly, he seemed to be benign too, according to her grandmother. She said he was a nice old hermit guy, but everybody was terrified of him because he could change into a werewolf. And supposedly he was the only one who had no fear of the nameless thing. And he would tell them, he goes, I know exactly what that thing is. It can't hurt me. It won't hurt me. And if it tries, I'll kill it. But it's not going to come down to the land and fight with me. It's just going to be up in the air. And he also raised sheep. And he had a herd of sheep. And sometimes he'd be seen sleeping out there with his flock. And he was the only one in the whole area for 30 kilometers around that could do that, because everyone else had to pen their sheep up at night because this thing would kill them. But for this guy, nothing ever happened to him. Nothing. Like, he was completely, and his name was like Petrov or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce it. Petorikov, whatever. But he was pretty much immune to this creature, which I thought was interesting, that she said that she goes, and who knows if this guy was truly able to do the things they say he was. But if you went to him, he could fashion an amulet with an iron cross in the middle of it. I don't mean the iron cross is like from Germany, but this iron cross that he could make, because he was also like a sort of a part-time smither, and he would make it with a little bit of silver. And if you wore it, the nameless thing couldn't hurt you. And so you had people all over this area that would come to this guy to get protection from this creature, whatever it was, this demonic flying entity. And I thought it was interesting that a lot of the people were superstitious enough that they believed that he was able to shapeshift. Now, as far as I know, no one ever saw it, but she had a cousin named Alexa, and that person believed that this person was a werewolf because that was the only person who had seen a giant black wolf going into his house, a wolf about the size of half the size of a horse, going into his house on a nightly basis, and this man would come out. Now, the reason that this person would see it is because they were neighbors and they lived on the outskirts of the village. And there again, the wolf never attacked her, never did anything to her, never tried to molest her in any way. But the interesting thing was that everyone was terrified of this man. But he had no record of hurting anyone or killing anyone. So they just kind of left him alone. When the Germans came, many of them, after having dealt with this nameless thing, they were seen wearing these amulets that were given to them by this supposed whatever he was, witch, warlock, werewolf, I don't know what he was. And so they were seen wearing those. And then sure enough, once the Soviets came in and took it back over, they were seen wearing the same, amulets or whatever that were made by this guy. And that was the only thing, these silver crosses were the only thing that could keep that thing from attacking you. And supposedly, according to her grandmother, Martha's grandmother, Anna, said no one that wore those was ever attacked. And she's like, how do you know? And she's like, well, because I wore one. She's like, my parents got one. And this guy, he would make them like, just bunches of them and give them to people to ward off this creature. And then one night his house burned down, and they believed that it was the Soviets that had burned it down. And then he left the area and he gave his sheep to the townspeople. And then the nightmare got worse with this creature until they believed the Soviets were finally able to subdue it, take it to the train station, and eventually ship it back east to Russia, where the legend says, and there's nobody that can verify this at all, that it eventually escaped and was able to do whatever it did or whatever, which wouldn't surprise me. But they were given a design on how to imprison and keep this creature in this cage, because regular metal wasn't going to keep it locked up. It had to be a certain amount of iron, and it had to have silver threading around it. So I asked how she knew this, and Martha says, well, my grandmother, Anna, when they snuck onto the train platform, train station, whatever, to check this creature out, she said that there was this thin silver wiring all the way around it, and she could see those little crosses all over it. And that seemed to keep this thing inside the cage, and that the bars were iron, and that some of it you could see it was even rusting. And she said that that was the only thing that would work, and that her dad, Anna's dad, which would have been Martha's great-grandfather, had said that this was the only way that Petrov, whatever his name, Petrov, whatever, the supposed werewolf guy, I don't know if he's a werewolf, but whatever, supposedly the guy that had the pelt that could change into a wolf, had said that's the only way to imprison a creature like that. And talking to her great-grandfather, he told him, he's like, the only way to defeat this thing is to decapitate or to burn it. And like you were saying, primordial. Yeah. That this is an ancient creature, and that there's only certain beings that can even come close to facing this thing. And according to the warlock or whatever they say he was, the hermit, that this thing came from within the earth, and it was like not that its age was not measured in tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. And it not even originally from this planet. It's from somewhere else. So this thing, the Nameless thing, which got this horrible reputation for being such a horrible villain and doing all these awful things, it was super strong, and it was said to have even knocked over a German half-track one time while it was trying to grab soldiers. Their machine gun fire from the Russians and Germans and Latvians had an effect on it. It would get it to go away, but it wouldn't kill it. And like I said, even a 20 mil that flew through its chest, the right side of its chest, didn't stop it. Interesting thing, too, when the Germans had it hanging up in that barn, or on the side of the barn, it didn't have any internal organs, according to their official reports that the Soviets intercepted. And one of the Soviet officers who made friends with Anna, which is Marta's grandmother, and her husband, her grandfather, this thing didn't have any organs, according to the Germans. It was just full of blood and weird tube-like things that sort of resembled arteries, but there was no heart. There was no anything. And some of these tube-like things in its body fell out onto the ground and were slithering around like worms.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So what the physiology of this thing was is anybody's guess. Like, what the hell is that? I mean, and that its eyes fell out of its head and its tongue fell out, but then they regenerated. So very bizarre, very weird.
Burn that thing to ashes to kill it.
Well, but the problem was they wanted to observe what it was. You know what I mean? So all these different military people were like, oh, well, let's take it and figure out what it is. Instead, they should have been decapitating and burning it, but they didn't. That was the big mistake, and it caused a lot of carnage. And now, supposedly, it became a matter of Soviet record because they intercepted the records from the Germans. The Germans had the record of it. They kept track of this thing and said, hey, it did this, it did that. The locals lived in absolute fear of this thing. And then after World War II, of course, it gets caught and shipped off, I believe, in 1947 or something like that. I think that was the year. But, yeah, so what do you guys think? I mean,
I think this thing is like, I mean, if we're correct in our assumption that this thing is like hundreds of thousands of years old, it's just an ancient primordial creature from which modern day vampires descend, that is probably one of the rarest like cryptids or monsters around, because if you think about it, there's probably not a whole lot of them left, not only because of how old they are, but because of how violent they are. And the nature of evil is to turn on itself and destroy itself. So like the ones that are still alive today are probably revered almost as like living gods or demigods to the vampires who descend from them now, because they have their elders who are, you know, like thousands of years old, but I mean those elders, like they're not the top of the food chain. I think these very ancient, like primitive monsters are.
Think about the Minotaur. You know how we had the pictures from the Vatican of the Minotaur?
Yeah, and the St. George's Keep picture.
Supposedly they're so violent, they were so aggressive, and they were created by Tiamat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that I'm not going to get into the whole thing or whatever, but because we don't have time, but the Minotaur was so aggressive and so violent, along with the Scorpion Man, that they were mostly wiped out because they were so violent. But yeah, what do you think, Tony?
I mean, I was going to disagree with Anthony. Like that assumption is basis on the fact that, you know, these creatures have any sort of respect or really give in to something as simple as age. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that they're bloodsuckers, they're pests, they're basically entirely in it for themselves. So they don't care how old you are. They don't care if you're the ancient one.
Well, it's not a matter of age, though. It's a matter of fear.
Well, hold on. Because it's just more that you've been alive so long, you know the most. And you are the most, like, powerful in that sense. And the fact that you have been there to experience stuff that we haven't. Because, I mean, you have to realize, too, for a spirit and for creatures that live that long, what is time? What does it matter if I'm immortal? How long you lived? How long you have been here? Because all that really matters is that, okay, you've had this long to accumulate this much power. So you've had that much longer than me. But if I, you know, let's say, let's just say there's like, you know, you drink the blood to gain power. So let's say like, oh, he's had 100,000 years to drink blood to gain power, right? Mm-hmm. But I go directly and go, okay, I'm going to kill something so infinitesimally stronger than me and drink its blood that time doesn't matter. So then at that point, who's really more respectful? Because I think it's more about just power. So I think it's just simply like who has the most power, whether it be simply like, you know, generational, where like, okay, I gathered a following, I have people who, you know, they may not be loyal to me, but I have something on them, or I have an ability to hold my dominion over them so that I have a grouping, or that they themselves are just a being that is so, like, you don't want to mess with it. You just leave it alone so much that's where your power comes from. I think, yeah, you know, for creatures that are so inherently selfish and entirely like they kill and drink the blood of others to survive, I don't really see them holding this hierarchy that isn't based on like.
Yeah, in my opinion, I agree with you. I think that the modern day vampire would just kill it if they could.
If they could
kill each other.
Well, that's the thing.
I mean, if they could figure out a way to take its power,
they could. But they can't.
Who was this guy that was this Petrov that was immune to this thing?
I don't know, but whatever he's tapping into, I don't think that a modern vampire would be able to do that.
That's why I think like that's where their power lies in. Is like, I know something you don't. That's it. I think it's just
codes.
Yeah, I have the cheat codes. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, you're still playing around, flying around, doing magic. I teleport.
Yeah, this is like
It's like, yeah, okay.
I mean, I'm not saying that there's like a hierarchy based on reverence for age. I'm saying it's maintained through violence, fear, intimidation,
oppression.
It's like they don't have a choice but to elevate this thing to the level of.
It's definitely a pyramidal dictatorial.
Yeah,
I
mean, if they could, they would eat it alive. Huh?
I said, I wish we could figure out like who is at the top of this. I mean,
it's kind of. I think it's weird because like then you really see like the true, like real evil. Are they like at the top because they're the most sneakiest? They're the ones who can prop and connive and get their enemies to kill each other and go to war, and they just never worry about it. Or are they just physically the strongest being? And it's just like I'm pretty sure in worlds like Dogman or Bigfoot, like when you're really dealing with those more savage and aggressive ones. The strongest one of those I would be terrified of because it's the baddest mother effer around. Like he's the scariest one because he's the one. If he can control all these monsters, I don't want to mess with him.
I think that maybe the closer they get to the original source of where these creatures came from, maybe like the more powerful those creatures become. Like.
I think that makes sense. Like it's like
because they had to come from somewhere, and like ultimately, like if you can identify the one place or being from which they all sprang or from which they all descended, then that one source would probably be the most powerful being amongst that species of living creature.
I mean, I see it a lot, and like when I read novels, they have a lot of stories where it's like, oh, okay, one really strong, powerful guy started a family, but then after that, it just slowly dilutes.
Yeah,
and it's like because like in his bloodline or whatever, they just never really achieve that same potential, and it's the same even in here. It's just with money.
If that's the way it works, then you have to ask yourself, like, if these things have had like thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years where there's generation after generation of vampire, and if after each generation the bloodline is diluted and they're less powerful, well, if a modern day vampire, if that's as powerful as they are, if that's 100,000 years worth of diluting power, then like how powerful were these things originally?
I know.
I mean, that's insane.
Well, think about it like this. I look at it like this. These things could have been first generation, maybe even descended from the rebellious angels, not the fallen, not Nephilim.
Yeah.
But maybe they were like when you read about Lilith, who's always connected to the vampire. And that she bred with Satan, which is Lucifer. Like they had children. These could have been the children, like first generation, right out of the or I guess second generation. I wonder about this because and I always go back to the apocryphal of James, or the apocalypse of James. Jesus tells James, "Flee Jerusalem, for it is full of archons." And I wonder about that because. And then there was a really cool series that came out like on Netflix or something.
Midnight Mass.
Midnight Mass, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up.
Because you remember how that creature, I don't remember the show completely because I hate to say this.
Well, the guy thought that
it was falling asleep because Nelly makes me watch it when I'm tired. And I never, how I do, I can't never watch shows. I always fall asleep.
Yeah.
But I remember that creature being found in like a cave or something.
Yeah, he found it in a cave. I think like somewhere
he was on a pilgrimage.
In the Middle East. Yeah,
he was on a pilgrimage.
And then when he found it, he believed that it was an angel.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's a demon.
Yeah.
Well, not nearly a demon. I think these things are archons.
Like you said, it could have been one of the rebellious angels.
It could have been the rebellious angels' children.
Yeah.
It could have been Lilith's child.
Well, I liked at the end of that show, like it leads to like this question of like, oh, we don't know what the heck that thing is, because like you see, he acts like, oh, you're supposed to revere this thing. It's holy. The priest acts in this way. He's like, oh, this is more than we understand. But then when you see it at the end, where like the boat is gone, you know, the island is burning and everything. No spoilers if you haven't seen it, but everything is in ruins, and you see this creature act exactly like this evil spawn creature. Like it reverts to this feral form, where it realizes like, oh, I'm screwed. There's nothing for me to do, and it flees in terror. So we're like, oh, so it wasn't, you know, whatever the heck this priest thought it was. It like we had no idea. It was just some beast that did what beasts do. So and I'd like to think like that's how probably these modern vampires are. Like that's probably a better way to look at them. Is like, oh, they're just a beast, and like those things
they could come from the Levant. I mean, that's a very, you know, and. So, you know, that's why Jesus tells James to flee, to run, to get away from there, because it's full of monsters, you know. I mean, really, spiritual, you know, in between metaphysical beings, you know, that can hurt you, you know. And anyways, there's no telling what this was or what it is. But thank you, Martha, for sending that story. It's an amazing one. And we've had this, I've sat on this one for a while, and I just wanted to say, hey, it is interesting, true or not. I mean, we have no way to know how much of it is true and how much of it is just people saying things, you know, whatever. But still an interesting story. I mean, it's an interesting tale, you know, and I appreciate that people from other countries actually do send us, you know, stuff, because you don't get that from a lot of other, not to toot our horn or anything, but you know what I mean? Like we do a lot of international stuff, and that's a pretty cool story. Yeah. But I would hate to be the one dealing with it. It's not cool if you're, you know, dealing with this monster, but who knows? But anyways, for everyone here at PRT, thank you for tuning in for another episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And be sure and check us out every Sunday. We do a live stream. It usually goes 2.5, 3 hours. What else do we got going on? We're going to be dropping a pre-record every week, getting back on track so people on Spotify can quit screaming. Yeah. And then we got the investigations we're going to start doing on Fridays, and then Thursdays is going to be Patreon Q&A. And we may do that every week, or we may do it every 2 weeks. But we'll be doing that November 21st. Okay, folks, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you. Good night.